It's time to take a trip back to the Middle Ages. Today I'll be exploring haunted castles, a medieval Japanese island, and Scotland's fairy fields. The land of Cockaigne. The land of Cockaigne was utopia in the Middle Ages. In 12th century Europe, stories began appearing of a mysterious land filled with abundance. The rivers overflowed with wine, plump geese were everywhere for the eating, and youth lasted forever. It was a paradise that never existed, at least not outside the minds of those who desired it. The first mention of Cockaigne comes from a French text in 1250. Out of its 188 verses, 58 of them talk about food. Food really was the most valuable commodity in the Middle Ages. Drought and famine caused unimaginable suffering and death. For medieval people, a land where food was always available seemed like the closest thing to heaven. If a peasant from medieval Germany or England were alive today, they would be awestruck by the very existence of a grocery store. Medieval people didn't have movies or TV. Most of the books they had were religious in nature. Plus, hardly anybody could read who wasn't a scribe or part of the nobility. Telling stories of a mystical land where you could bathe in wine rivers would have been a great form of entertainment for people. In their imaginary world of Cockaigne, houses were edible. Nobody had to work, nobody had to eat boring bread anymore, and instead could stuff their face with sausage and bacon. By the 14th century, the myth of Cockaigne had spread throughout much of Europe. It became such a popular fable that there were different versions of the story depending on where you were. In the Italian version, their utopia had its own mountain of grated Parmesan cheese. The fable came to an end by the 17th century. The land of Cockaigne had turned into a children's fairy tale condemning gluttony and laziness. The island of Baltia. The island of Baltia comes from only one written source. The only account of this island as a real place is in Naturalis Historia, a book published by Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD. According to Pliny, Baltia was an island created when a massive chunk of amber fell through the atmosphere and impacted the planet. This happened somewhere in the Baltic Sea or the North Sea. Although there is only a single known record of Baltia in written history, stories of the island survived orally. The ancient Greeks believed in it, as did people in the Middle Ages. The legend was that if you could find the island, you could harvest raw amber. And what did you use raw amber for? Magical purposes. It was believed the raw amber from Baltia could be used in the forging of magical weapons, armor, and items. Many early alchemists believed amber as a material came from the cosmic void and therefore was rich in magic energy. But in truth, there is no island made of amber that scientists have ever found. Berg Eltz. Very few European castles have remained untouched since their creation, but the Berg Eltz in central Germany castle has. It's an epic medieval stronghold that has been standing unmarred for 800 years. It was created on the road the Romans once walked, built upon a high rock and flanked on three sides by a raging river. Trees loom above the castle's ramparts, the forest seeming to cling to the great work of stone. It really is a castle straight out of a fairy tale. The castle came to life in the 12th century when three local lords pooled their money to build a defensive fortification. Those three local lords never relinquished control of the castle. Their descendants still own it. The families of Rodendorf, Rubenach, and Kempenich have been presiding over the castle for 33 generations. It's now the 21st century, and like most castles in Europe, the Berg Eltz is a tourist attraction. Two sections of the building are open for visitors. The third section is off limits because it's still home to the Kempenich family. Just think about how lucky that family is. Imagine how cool it would be to trace 33 generations of your family history back to the same house. These people have been living in the same rooms since the Crusades. And now for number 7. But first, it's shout-out time. I wanted to give a big thank you to Bjorn Damrong 3289 and Sam Rolk 8097 for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. Medieval Dartmoor. There is no one specific place in Dartmoor that's more mystically medieval than another. The whole landscape is a mythical playground, rife with tales of giants, demons, and cackling witches. Dartmoor also happens to be the only place in England where wild camping is legal. It draws people from all over the world to explore its secrets and legends. Let me start as far back as I possibly can. 2 million years ago, Dartmoor was a prehistoric island, tropical and overrun with strange creatures. 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended and Dartmoor was an untouched land of oak forests. Then roughly 5,000 years ago, prehistoric humans arrived. They started clearing the woods, essentially paving Dartmoor into a barren land of grassy plains and granite hills. One of the greatest mysteries of Dartmoor is Hound Tor, a cursed medieval village. The land here has been farmed since the Bronze Age. At some point during the Middle Ages, a village sprang up in the grassy fields. That village is now quiet and abandoned, its crumbling stone ruins ghostly to behold. Nobody knows how it came to be abandoned, though it's been rumored the whole place was decimated by the plague. Nowadays there are wildflowers growing between the stone blocks where once medieval people lived. The village of Grimspound is another mystery. It's been partially reconstructed on the windswept hills of Dartmoor, currently under control of the English Heritage Trust. 24 circular huts stand nestled in a gently rolling valley with extensive views of the countryside. The name of the villages comes from Grim, the Anglo-Saxon god of war. Another place is Lidford Castle. Despite its name, this structure was never a castle at all. It was used as a prison and holds memories of horror in its clammy corners. Even the building is ominous to look at. It's a squat, square construct built in the 13th century that exudes evil vibes. Local historians say the dark and creepy ruin was used as a prison all the way until the 19th century. Can you imagine being locked inside this thing? Last but not least, and not even last because there are dozens of places across Dartmoor that will transport you to the medieval days, is Castle Drogo. Historians think it was the last castle ever built in England. That means it technically isn't medieval. The architecture was based on the old Norman style of castle. Its roof is leaking and it needs major renovations, but it still stands. Izena Island. Let's take a break from medieval Europe and visit the world of medieval Japan. The island of Izena is a small piece of land, barely more than 3 miles in diameter. It can be found in the East China Sea near Okinawa. It's a truly fabulous place to visit these days, surrounded by vivid blue coral reefs and mouth-watering white beaches. The island only has 5 settlements on it, each one about the same size. The most famous village shares its name with the island. Izena village was the birthplace of King Shoen, who ruled the second Shou dynasty in the 15th century. Islands have their own unique culture no matter where you go in the world, and Izena is no exception. In medieval times, people here were devout worshippers of sea deities, but the worship of mysterious ocean gods has probably been going on for 16,000 years. Pottery and archaeological ruins have been discovered on the tiny piece of land from the Joseon period, which dates back to 14,000 BC. The island is also home to one of the most incredible medieval castles in Japan. Izena Castle was built at some point in the 14th century on a limestone outcrop. The castle looms 330 feet above the restless sea, 3 sides of the structure practically sheer with the vertical cliffs below. It's hard to tell where the castle ends and the natural rock begins. The castle's so close to the ocean, the local lord could have made his enemies walk the plank from one of the castle's windows. Sadly, the years have not been kind to the fortification. It's in atrocious condition, run down and broken. Torlites Lighthouse and Andros Castle. Perched atop a spindly rock spire off the coast of Greece is a wizard's tower. At least it looks like a wizard's tower. The truth is that it's a lighthouse from the 19th century. It's a modern construct that looks like a place where Merlin from the court of King Arthur would live. It's called the Torlites Lighthouse, and it is by far one of the coolest lighthouses in the world. The rock upon which it was built is so heavily eroded, it's baffling that the lighthouse hasn't fallen over yet. Construction began in 1897, right offshore from the much older Andros Castle. It shone its beacon for a few decades before the start of World War II. Then it was destroyed, and the spindly rock spire was left barren. The original lighthouse was gone, faded even from memory. Then, in the 1990s, an oil tycoon thought it would be fun to recreate the lighthouse. A new structure was built, believed to be a fairly honest replica of the original. It became the first automated lighthouse in Greece. It was the first lighthouse that didn't need a human to operate the light. The lighthouse may only be 30 years old, but it still looks like a place where a sorcerer would live. Andros itself is an ancient and fantastic place. It's the northernmost island of the Cyclades archipelago. As I mentioned earlier, Torlites Lighthouse was built near Andros Castle. What I didn't mention is that you can see the lighthouse from the ruins of the castle. That's how close they are. But the castle is way older than the lighthouse. After the fall of Constantinople, battle in 1204, the disastrous ending of the Fourth Crusade, Andros was captured by the ruthless Venetians. They built 3 castles on the island to protect it from anyone who might try to reclaim it. The most important was Andros Castle, the one looking across the water at the Wizard Tower. It worked as a deterrent from invasion until 1566. Then the Ottoman Navy captured Andros and the castle. Being 300 years old, it was not of particular use anymore, but it remained in good shape until World War II. Along with the lighthouse, Andros Castle was blown to smithereens by the Germans in 1943. Unlike the lighthouse, Castle Andros has never been rebuilt. It's a sad, busted remnant of what Greece was like during the Crusades. The Kami ruins. Africa had its own impressive medieval empires that rivaled those in Europe, especially in Zimbabwe, where you can find the breathtaking Kami ruins. In modern Zimbabwe, not far from the borders of Botswana and South Africa, the Torwa state once dominated the region. Between the 10th and 19th centuries, the Torwa culture was an unstoppable force. They ruled the land from their capital, the city of Kami. As you may be able to guess, Zimbabwe has a very long history of human occupation. Human beings did evolve in Africa, so it only makes sense. Archaeologists have found ancient tools from the earliest parts of the Stone Age near the ruins of Kami. There are also much earlier ruins from semi-permanent settlements 2,000 years ago, when people began farming in Zimbabwe. But it was 1,000 years ago that modern civilization took root here. That was when urban settlements began to grow. Tribes began experimenting with kingship, and trading networks made cities filthy rich. Kami became important in 1450 AD. It was a powerful medieval city with high stone walls, its rulers exuding their influence deep into the Kalahari Desert. They traded in cattle, which helped them to become wealthy. Then they were invaded by their rivals, the Roswi, around 1683. The city of Kami, under new management, grew even larger and more powerful. By the 19th century, Kami was rapidly losing its significance. Living in medieval cities with stone walls was no longer the norm. People gradually left, and soon Kami was deserted. Nobody has occupied it since. The old stone walls still stand in many places, though the buildings are mostly sunken into the ground or overgrown with grass and small trees. Kami is one of the few surviving reminders of the great kingdoms that dominated Africa before European intervention. The Fairy Glen. Scotland's Fairy Glen is one of the most magical landscapes in the world. If you've ever wanted to see a place that makes you feel as though fairies and pixies, leprechauns and trolls could be hiding around every corner, Fairy Glen is that place. The glen is located on the Isle of Skye, which is already the most picturesque medieval place in Scotland. The remote island in the far north of the Highlands is scantily populated and dotted with ancient ruins. The Isle of Skye itself is home to multiple castles, along with majestic mountains and dramatic views of grassy meadows. Fairy Glen is not technically an ancient site. It does look like somewhere you would expect to find mythical creatures, but it isn't home to any ruins or physical remains. It's a unique geological formation caused by a landslip, which basically lumped a bunch of hills together to make a fairy playground. You may find stone mounds in the area and cairns, but these are not ancient. They're made by tourists during the high season. Then, when the tourists leave for the winter, the locals go to the glen and remove the stone creations. It's doubtful you'll see any real fairies, but if you talk to the locals enough, they'll tell you all about the mystical fairy lore of the island. The Church of Andrew the Apostle. The Church of Andrew the Apostle is a picturesque religious building in the middle of a lake. The church isn't ancient, not even remotely, but it does look like something you would come across while exploring a medieval realm. The church was built in the year 2000 on a small stone island in Lake Vuoksa, Russia. It's about 2 hours from St. Petersburg. The church is made of wood planks built in a traditional Russian style to make it look old. It looks as if it should be in a Baba Yaga legend, but in reality it was modeled after the Church of the Ascension in Moscow. Even though it's a church, there are no scheduled ceremonies. Sometimes it's rented for baptisms or weddings, but otherwise it's a closed church sitting on a rock for absolutely no reason. Though it is in the Guinness Book of World Records as the only church built on a tiny island. How would you fare in medieval times? Which kingdom do you think you'd last the longest in? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Come back soon and remember to subscribe before you go.